There are movies that entertain you, and then there are movies that somehow become part of you. Uncle Buck is the second kind. Released in the summer of 1989, it arrived without much fanfare beyond the promise of John Candy being John Candy, and it ended up doing something far more lasting than anyone on a marketing team probably predicted. It hit number one at the box office, held its ground for weeks, and then quietly settled into the kind of cultural permanence that studios can't manufacture and publicists can't spin. People didn't just like it. They kept it. They rewatched it. They quoted it to their kids, and then watched their kids quote it to theirs. But underneath all that warmth, underneath the pancake flipping and the enormous car and the mail slot interrogation, there's a production full of choices, accidents, and hidden decisions that most people who love this film have never heard about. Some of them changed the course of Hollywood. Some of them no longer physically exist. And at least one of them gave birth to an entirely different movie that went on to become just as beloved. This is the story behind the story, and it starts before a single frame was ever shot. The role of Buck Russell almost didn't belong to John Candy. Early conversations during casting reportedly circled through several well-known comedic performers, each of whom would have pulled the character in a completely different direction. The entire tone of the film was essentially suspended in uncertainty, waiting to crystallize around whoever walked through that door. What made Candy the answer wasn't just his size or his timing, though both were considerable. It was something harder to name and impossible to fake. He projected warmth without appearing to try, and that quality is rarer in comedy than most people realize. A sharp performer might have made Buck funnier in individual moments, while making him fundamentally less likable as a whole. Candy found the softness beneath the chaos, and that softness is the reason audiences didn't just laugh at Buck, but genuinely rooted for him across every mess he stumbled into. The script gave John Hughes a workable comic vehicle. Candy gave it a pulse. His improvised moments, his ability to pivot from completely ridiculous to unexpectedly sincere within a single breath, his instinct for when to hold back, none of that was contractually guaranteed. It came from the specific human being holding the role, and imagining anyone else holding it feels genuinely impossible once you understand what he actually brought to it. Now here's where things get remarkable in a way that extends well beyond the single film. Early in the story, there's a brief scene at the front door of the Russell house where young Miles interrogates Buck through the mail slot. It is a small scene by any conventional measure, a quick bit of physical comedy with a child controlling access to a space. But John Hughes was watching, and what he saw in Macaulay Culkin during those moments fundamentally altered his vision for a project he had not yet fully committed to making. Here was a child performer who could command a scene entirely on his own terms, who could make a simple spatial setup feel genuinely funny and surprisingly tense without any adult carrying him through it. The image of a clever kid holding his ground, controlling his environment, outwitting the larger and supposedly more powerful person on the other side of the door planted something specific in Hughes's imagination. That something became Home Alone, the defend the house concept, the child as the capable center of the story, the physical comedy rooted in one control location. All of it connects directly back to what Hughes observed on this set. Culkin's performance didn't just make Uncle Buck better. It quietly convinced a filmmaker that an entirely different movie could be built around a single child who refused to yield, and that movie would go on to become one of the highest-grossing comedies ever made. Finding the right space to shoot the film led the production to a solution that was more practical than glamorous, but ended up being genuinely clever. A vacant high school was converted into a fully functioning studio, with gymnasium spaces transformed into interior sound stages that gave the crew controlled environments they were paid considerably more for through conventional means. Lighting, sound, and scheduling could all be managed under one roof, which removed the unpredictability that location shooting routinely introduces into productions of this scale. The efficiency this created showed up in the finished film in ways that are easy to feel but difficult to point to directly. A production that isn't constantly fighting its own logistics has energy to spend on the actual work, and that energy accumulates across hundreds of small decisions made throughout a shoot. It is the kind of unglamorous problem-solving that never gets discussed in press interviews, but quietly determines whether a film holds together or falls apart under its own weight. Now here is where things get remarkable in a way that extends well beyond a single film. Early in the story, There's a brief scene at the front door of the Russell house where young Miles interrogates Buck through the mail slot. It is a small scene by any conventional measure, a quick bit of physical comedy with a child controlling access to a space. But John Hughes was watching, and what he saw in Macaulay Culkin during those moments fundamentally altered his vision for a project he had not yet fully committed to making. Here was a child performer who could command a scene entirely on his own terms, who could make a simple spatial setup feel genuinely funny and surprisingly tense without any adult carrying him through it. The image of a clever kid holding his ground, controlling his environment, outwitting the larger and supposedly more powerful person on the other side of the door planted something specific in Hughes's imagination. That something became Home Alone, the defend the house concept. The child as a capable center of the story, the physical comedy rooted in one control location. All of it connects directly back to what Hughes observed on this set. Culkin's performance didn't just make Uncle Buck better. It quietly convinced a filmmaker that an entirely different movie could be built around a single child who refused to yield, and that movie would go on to become one of the highest-grossing comedies ever made. Chicago wasn't where the story happened. It was woven into what the story was about, and the geography was chosen with the same care that went into every other element of production. When the film landed a PG rating upon its 1989 release, some audience members registered mild surprise. Certain exchanges felt sharper than the classification typically promised. Several scenes carried an undercurrent that sat a little uneasily alongside the family comedy branding. The MPAA standards of the late 80s operated under different assumptions than those applied today, allowing for a degree of adult language and thematic weight that modern classifications would almost certainly push into PG-13 territory. Hughes operated confidently within those boundaries, fully aware that the audience he was writing for expected something with real bite alongside the warmth. Watching it now, that tonal contrast becomes more noticeable rather than less. The film refused to fully soften itself for the sake of easy comfort, and that refusal is a significant reason it still feels alive more than 3 decades later. A cleaner version of this story would have been a lesser one. The soundtrack does something specific and somewhat unusual for a film from this era. Rather than feeling dated by its unmistakably late 80s atmosphere, it feels defined by it. Composer Ira Newborn built a score that shifts registers as smoothly as the film itself moves between humor and genuine feeling, providing comedic punctuation where needed and emotional warmth where something quieter was called for. The tracks selected to accompany specific scenes weren't decoration. They were tools for shaping how individual moments landed, and the calibration throughout is remarkably precise. The difference between a soundtrack that makes a film feel old and one that makes it feel permanent lies in how organically the choices fit the material. Nothing here sounds forced or commercially calculated. The result is an audio backdrop that doesn't merely support the story but becomes part of its texture, the kind of sound design that triggers immediate recognition in anyone who experienced a film during its original run and feels entirely natural to anyone discovering it for the first time. The bowling alley that contributed so much atmosphere to the film no longer exists. Demolished not long after filming wrapped, lost the kind of urban redevelopment that quietly erases pieces of the city's past without ceremony or announcement. It left behind no physical trace. What replaced offers nothing of the visual character that made it worth shooting in the first place. For fans who watched the film and later went looking, discovering that the location had simply vanished carries a particular kind of weight. It is a reminder that cinema preserves places that reality doesn't always bother to protect. The bowling alley now exists only on screen, which gives those scenes a slightly different quality. Once you know, they're the last reliable record of how that space looked and felt at a specific moment in time. Films accumulate this kind of archival significance gradually and without anyone planning for it, and it tends to make already meaningful footage feel like something more. The Russell family home has had precisely the opposite fate. It still stands largely unchanged in the Chicago suburbs, an ordinary residential property that has quietly earned a place on an informal map of locations that fans of a certain era seek out. It was chosen for exactly the qualities that made it memorable on screen, an approachable, unpretentious exterior that communicated middle American family life without overstating it. Its visual language is deliberately unspectacular, which was entirely the point. a more architecturally distinctive property, would have undermined the Russells' fundamental ordinariness, and that ordinariness was essential to making the story feel real. Fans who visit describe a quiet but genuine sense of recognition, the sensation of encountering a real place that previously existed only through a screen. For a film so deeply rooted in Chicago's suburban identity, there's something right about the central location surviving intact while the bowling alley disappeared. It functions as a small physical anchor for everything the film represents.